talking about the challenges facing Iraq. Joining us here in Washington is Brigadier General Ismail al-Sudani. He spent nearly 30 years in the Iraqi army, retiring in 2011. And with us from the Brookings Institution, a leading U.S. think tank, is Michael O'Hanlon. He's a strategic military and foreign policy analyst and co-author of Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century. Thank you both for joining us. Let's get straight to it. Brigadier General al-Sudani, you've had experience on the ground, both in Baghdad and here in Washington. Did Abadi get what he came for?
First of all, thank you for having me here in Washington, D.C. It's premature to judge on whether Prime Minister Abadi has gotten whatever he is asking or he is requesting from his visit. Apparently, all the environment, all the things here in Washington, D.C. are very positive. The outcome from the visit itself very positive, from the delegation, from the U.S. administration as well. What we need to see in the future that things are on the ground to be accomplished.
What does the U.S. need in terms of reassurances, Brigadier General, before it commits to the military aid that Iraq's been asking for a very long time now?
I think there are potential concerns that United States administration has and Iraqi Prime Minister needs to address.
What are they?
These are the first, all the forces on the ground that fighting ISIS should be under the control of the government. The second, how deep the Iranian involvement in Iraq. And the third, which is more political, that is how inclusive the government is a performance in a political arena inside Iraq with the internal or domestic players.
You're talking about reconciliation, of course with Sunnis and the Kurds as well. Michael, does that stick to you, that Washington needs these concerns met? Shiite militias under their own control, Iran's involvement, and of course political progress to a unified Iraq all have to be delivered before more weapons?
Well, not before. I think the General is correct that these are the right goals long term, not only for America's interests, but for Iraq's own well-being and Iraq's strength as a nation. And therefore, they should be viewed as long-term goals that we're all striving to make gradual progress towards, especially Iraqis themselves. And the United States has to try to see where it can support at the margin. But I don't think you can make these preconditions for helping Iraq in a mortal fight against a terrible enemy that we have to get after ourselves for our own good, and not only in Iraq, but in Syria. And at least in Iraq, there's a little bit of a plan you can put on paper and aspire to carry out, and that's begun to be applied in Tikrit. But the Syria problem is even harder and going to take even longer. So we've really got to get after this. ISIL needs to be defeated. This is a joint American-Iraqi interest, and we can't be too particular about making Iraq achieve a bunch of milestones that we think are in our interest before helping it in this immediate and urgent fight.
Yeah, while the U.S. is being particular, 25% of ISIL has been destroyed by some airstrikes, the Pentagon estimates, but also on the ground, the fight is being led by the Iraqi army, but also very much supported by Shiite militias and also with Iran's backing. Brigadier General, has the U.S. reticence here allowed a vacuum to be filled by the people that it doesn't get on with in the region, Iraq?
Well, let me tell you, it's one of the most potential issues that we need to understand, that Iraq is part of international coalition against ISIS. And one of the main interests of this coalition is defeating and degrading ISIS in Iraq and Syria and somewhere else in the region.
But Iran isn't officially part of this coalition. And where are the Sunni states in the region in terms of helping the Iraqi army? I mean, a lot of them seem to be involved in the Syrian side, but not so much in Iraq.
Well, let me tell you that Iranian involvement, and I think the Prime Minister made it clear today in his speech that Iranian involvement is welcomed, support to Iraqi army, support any support that could provide to Iraq, but with the respect of the Iraqi sovereignty. This is, I think, even the United States would like to see this kind of support from Iran. Iraq should be balanced between the West and the East. And of course, Iraq should have been in a position to address these issues and address these concerns to their partners in the region as well as in the international community.
Michael, do you agree? You wrote recently that the US can't be too utopian when it comes to the militias, which seems to be what the Brigadier General was saying as well. But given we have what's going on in Yemen, of course, where the Saudis and the Iranians are backing different sides, and the region as a whole, can Iraq be any different here?
Well, as the General well knows, Iraq, of course, is a much stronger state than Yemen. And historically, even though it's been beset by civil war in recent years, it's been a fairly cohesive state in which, admittedly, partly through Saddam Hussein's reign of terror, but nonetheless, many Sunnis and Shia lived together very well and harmoniously. And at the personal level, it was not because of terror. At the personal level, Iraqis had a truly integrated society. And I think the General would agree with me, but that was one of the most notable things about Iraq. It really was the meeting ground of Sunni and Shia in the Middle East. And there still are elements of that exist in Iraq, and we have to aspire to a day where that can be fully restored. So I think Iraqis have a strong sense of nationality and of pride in their own country. They're an Arab people. They're not a Persian people. Right. They don't want Iran to have undue influence. Now, this is not to say that the Iranian threat can be totally benign or written off, but I think Iraqis will push back in many ways and will make sure that they act in their own interest. So, to be honest with you, the Shia militias do worry me to some extent. The Iranian involvement worries me to some extent. But in the end, I do trust Iraqi pride and nationalism to ultimately be a bit of a bulwark against excessive Iranian infiltration.
Well, let's talk about Iraqi sovereignty and a feeling of nationalism. You, of course, Brigadier General, was part of the army. We've seen some success against ISIL in Tikrit, although hard won. We've seen ISIL popping up in Ramadi. Give us a snapshot of what the Iraqi forces need now, and also for the outsider, why can't they take the fight to ISIL quicker and more effectively?
Well, let's go back to 2014, actually the beginning of 2014, when Fallujah has been fall down at ISIS hands. That was the very first city that has been occupied by ISIS, and then was the following of Mosul, and Iraq has lost more than 40% Iraqi forces, 40% of their capabilities, whether weapons, human resources, and that needed to be recompensated. I think the Popular Mobilization Forces has been one of the options adopted by the government.
These are local forces which protect local areas. Michael, you're a big proponent of that. Why is that?
Well, I'm a proponent of that historically, but I think at this juncture, the idea that I'd like to see taken seriously, and I'd be curious if the General agrees, is the idea of an Iraqi National Guard. This was an idea that Prime Minister al-Abadi promoted last year. The United States also supported it. The idea was to allow people to be recruited, trained, and deployed locally to fight for their own communities, to organize the local self-defense forces into something that had a broader national institutional framework, and also allowed Baghdad to supervise, so that you would try to bring militias in provided they behaved in an acceptable fashion, and if they didn't, you would cut them off or otherwise punish them.
Right.
And that kind of idea, I think, has a lot of appeal. Unfortunately, from my mind, it has not been pursued very much since al-Abadi announced it last summer, partly because former Prime Minister Maliki didn't like it, and now people are worried that if you take this idea too far, you may actually legitimate some of these militias by letting them become part of the National Guard. But I actually think the militias are already powerful, and the better approach is to find a mechanism by which you can oversee, regulate, and induce them to behave well by paying salaries if they do behave well, but cutting off the money if they don't.
Brigadier General, do you agree? And will this mean that Mosul can be retaken and that Iraq can be stitched back together again?
Well, let me answer Mr. O'Halloran. I think he's right. You know, this is very challenging, you know, to convert the militia, to reintegrate the militias with the Iraqi security forces. This is very challenging, very long processes. I believe that it should be started by a political consensus between the Iraqi political rivals, the first, to address this issue, to abandon their influence.
So the Anbar tribes, the Kurds
Everybody,
and the Shiites sitting down, another national convention?
Everybody has to abandon, has to agree that the political influence should be out of the military institutions, in order the military institutions to be a state institution, not a government institution or a provincial institutions.
This sounds like a lot of work. In your opinion, how long is it going to take Iraqi forces and the coalition to kick ISIL out of the country?
Well, this is very, I cannot predict how long, but I think the ongoing operation right now that Iraqi forces now is turning towards Anbar, which I believe that comes first before Tikrit even.
Because of the Sunni majority there. Michael, the final word, do you think this is a really long fight that goes on beyond US President Barack Obama's final term, US forces very much still involved, putting ISIL out of Iraq? How long is it going to take?
I think the Iraqis may be able to do a good job with this over the next year or so. I don't think it's going to be complete, but I think major cities may well be back in government hands within the next year in Iraq. I think Syria will be a challenge for the next American president and for the international system for the rest of the decade at a minimum, and maybe even longer.